I'm Daniel Wilson, an Army veteran, and after 3 years, my K9 German Shepherd, Duke, recognized me. What happened next was unbelievable. They told me Duke was gone, that after the ambush near the Mexico border, no K9 could have survived. For 3 years, I carried that loss like a wound that never closed. Duke wasn't just a military dog. He was my partner, my brother, the only living thing that stood between me and death more times than I could count. But then, one quiet afternoon at the Brooklyn Flea Market in New York, I heard a bark I hadn't heard in years, a bark that stopped my heart cold. When our eyes met, with him tied by an old leather leash, time froze. Because somehow, against all logic, against everything I was told, Duke remembered. And what happened after that moment would change both our lives forever. Before you continue with the story, where in the world are you listening? Subscribe to the channel to see what happens next. It had been 3 years since I last saw Duke. I remember that mission like a scar, vivid, permanent, and painful to touch. It was supposed to be a routine surveillance operation, tracking narcotics traffickers in Winter Haven, right along the Mexico border. Duke, my assigned K9, and I had worked together for almost 4 years by then. I trusted him more than any human in my unit. That German Shepherd saved my life more than once, sniffing out hidden drugs, warning me with a quick bark or a frozen stance when danger was near. But that day, everything changed. We were ambushed. There was a bomb. The last thing I remember before blacking out was Duke launching forward, trying to push me out of harm's way. When I woke up in a field hospital, bloodied and bruised, I asked for Duke again and again. All they told me was that he didn't make it. For a long time, I couldn't breathe right, not from my injuries, but from the silence. No dog had ever meant so much to me. I carried that guilt through surgeries, therapy, and every lonely night back in Georgia, where even the sound of the wind felt like a memory. I tried to move on, worked odd jobs, started a small mechanic business out of my garage, but a part of me always felt missing. That is, until one Thursday afternoon. I'd gone to the Brooklyn Flea Market in New York on a whim, not to adopt a dog, just to buy some used gardening tools I'd been needing for a small backyard project. The place was buzzing, packed with stalls selling everything from vintage clothes to handmade jewelry tucked under the open sky of Dumbo. As I browsed a stall piled high with rusty shovels and worn pruning shears, a sound hit me from the edge of the booth. A bark, sharp, powerful, familiar. I froze. My chest tightened. No, it couldn't be. But then it came again, louder, urgent. I didn't even think. I stepped around the stall, ignoring the vendor's curious glance, my boots crunching on the gravel until I saw him. There, tied to a post by an old, worn leather leash next to the gardening tool stall, was a German Shepherd, bigger now, with scars on his hind leg, eyes wide, ears forward, tail stiff, not wagging, but waiting. I stepped closer. My heart thundered so loud I couldn't hear anything else. The dog tilted his head slightly, took a step forward as far as the leash allowed, then another. And then it happened. A low, familiar whine, the kind Duke used to make only when I came home from base after long missions. A sound that had haunted my dreams more times than I cared to admit. "Duke," I said, my voice cracking. He barked once, then let out a whimper and strained against the leash, his tail now thumping hard against the ground. I dropped to my knees. "Buddy, no way. Is it really you?" Duke pawed at the dirt, desperate to close the space between us. The vendor, a wiry man in his 70s, looked over, slightly startled. "Hey, careful there. That one's new. Showed up near a gas station a couple towns over. No chip. Barely lets anyone near him." But I wasn't listening, and neither was Duke. Without thinking, I reached out toward him. Instead of growling or retreating, he nuzzled into my palm and let out a sound that could only be described as a cry. The vendor stared at us for a moment, unsure whether to believe what he was seeing. But something about the way Duke leaned into me, the way I whispered his name like a prayer, told him this was no coincidence. This was a reunion the world never expected. Whatever had happened during those 3 years apart was a story waiting to be uncovered. Duke didn't let go. Even after the vendor untied the old leather leash and I knelt to meet him, he buried his head against my chest and refused to move. He whimpered, then licked my hands with a desperation that didn't come from days without food. It came from years without a home. My throat tightened as I ran my fingers over the thick fur around his neck, then down his side. My hand paused when I felt something jagged beneath his coat. A scar. Then another. When Duke shifted, I saw it. A patch of missing fur near his ribs, skin puckered and raw. It wasn't fresh, but it was deep. And it wasn't the only one. "Who did this to you?" I whispered, anger boiling beneath my skin. The vendor, a kind man in his 70s named Marty, approached slowly. "We don't know exactly what happened to him," he said. "He was brought to me last month by a gas station worker who found him limping near his pumps, covered in mud and burns. The guy often patches up stray dogs and cats, so he thought I could find him a home. Took me 3 days to get close enough to clean him up." I looked at him, stunned. "You didn't try to identify him?" "We scanned for a chip," he said. There was nothing. He was skittish, even aggressive at times. I figured he was abandoned or a stray. Sometimes people dump old working dogs when they can't handle them anymore. I clenched my jaw. "He's not old," I said. "He's not a stray. He's ex-military K9, registered under Unit 66 Bravo. He saved lives. And they told me he died." Marty's face softened. "I believe you. Anyone can see this dog would follow you into fire." I stroked Duke's head gently. "He already did." Back at my truck, Duke climbed into the passenger seat like no time had passed. He turned in a circle, settled down, then rested his head on my leg as the engine rumbled to life. My fingers trembled on the wheel. I kept glancing over at him, afraid he'd disappear again. The ride home was silent, but something heavy lingered in the air, like the pieces of 2 broken hearts were trying to fit back together. When we pulled into the driveway, Duke perked up. His ears flicked forward, nose twitching. I parked the truck and walked around to open the door, but Duke was already out, sprinting to the porch. He sniffed every inch of it, then turned in a slow circle, as if remembering something. I watched from the steps. "You remember this place, don't you?" I asked. Duke looked up at me with those soulful brown eyes and gave a soft bark. I opened the door. Inside, everything was exactly how it had been. The bed in the corner where Duke used to sleep, the dented water bowl by the kitchen. I'd never gotten rid of any of it. I couldn't. Some part of me had refused to say goodbye. Now I didn't have to. That night, Duke didn't leave my side. He followed me from room to room as if afraid I'd vanish again. When I finally sat on the couch, Duke jumped up beside me and rested his head on my lap. I brushed his fur slowly, my other hand holding a worn photo, one of us from a training camp near the border. Duke in his tactical vest, me in uniform, both of us looking straight into the camera with the confidence of 2 souls who trusted only each other. "I thought I lost you," I said quietly, "but you found your way back." "How the hell did you do that?" Duke didn't answer, but his presence said everything. There were still questions, still scars, both visible and buried deep. I could see it in the way Duke flinched at sudden noises, how he tensed when headlights passed the window. Whatever had happened during those missing years had left its mark, but he was here now, alive, home. I leaned my head back, eyes closing. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel alone. And I knew whatever story Duke carried inside him, I was ready to uncover it together. The next morning, I woke up to a warm weight pressed against my leg. Duke was curled at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, chest rising in slow, peaceful breaths. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. I reached out and ran my fingers through Duke's fur, just to make sure he was real. But as the sunlight filtered through the blinds and lit the quiet bedroom, questions started circling in my mind. Where had Duke been all this time? How had he survived? Who hurt him? And most of all, why did no one tell me? By mid-morning, I found myself in the garage, a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand, Duke padding beside me. He stuck close, ears alert, nose constantly twitching, reacting to sounds I couldn't even hear. It reminded me of the old days, border patrols, intense silences that always meant danger. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home. I walked to a dusty storage shelf, pulled down a metal case, and set it on the workbench. I hadn't opened it in over a year. Inside were Duke's old service records, training logs, mission reports, everything we'd done together during our operations. I pulled out the file labeled Incident 53, Winter Haven Ambush. It detailed the attack that supposedly killed Duke. The timeline was vague. There was no recovered body, just an assumption. K9 presumed lost in action due to proximity to blast origin. No retrieval possible. I frowned. No retrieval, I muttered aloud. But what if Duke had survived that ambush? Injured, dazed, but alive. Could he have run? Been picked up by someone across the border? Smuggled away? My hand gripped the edge of the bench as the possibility sank in. I looked down at Duke, who now sat beside the toolbox, staring up at me with wide, alert eyes. "Did you try to come home, boy?" I asked softly. "Did they just forget about you?" Duke blinked slowly. Then, as if he understood, he stood and walked toward the garage door. I followed. Outside, the late morning sun cast golden streaks across the yard. Duke moved slowly now, sniffing the ground in long, deliberate motions. Then he stopped in the middle of the grass, turned toward the road, and sat completely still. "Something out there?" I asked, stepping beside him. But Duke didn't bark, didn't flinch. He stared at a passing white van and his body stiffened. In an instant, I saw it. The change in posture, the rigid tail, the narrowed eyes. I knew that stance. Duke was assessing danger, just like he had during our border missions. The van drove by slowly, then kept going. Duke didn't move until it disappeared around the curve of the street. I knelt beside him. "What did you see?" No answer, of course, but I could feel it. Duke remembered something. Not just the ambush, not just me, but who had hurt him, what had happened in the time we were apart, and maybe who was still watching. That night, I called in a favor. An old contact from the Army, Captain Walker, who transferred to civilian security work. I explained everything, the ambush, the Brooklyn Flea Market, Duke recognizing me, the scars, his behavior. "I know it sounds crazy," I said, "but I think someone took him. I think Los Zetas wanted him gone." Walker was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're not crazy. And if Los Zetas did take a trained K9, we need to know why." We agreed to meet the next day. I hung up the phone and turned to see Duke already watching me from the doorway, head tilted. "You knew they weren't done, didn't you?" I said with a half smile. "You've been trying to warn me." Duke wagged his tail once, not playful, not excited, just confirmation. I leaned down and looked my old partner in the eyes. "We'll find out what happened," I promised. "I promise." And in that quiet night, surrounded by shadows and questions, one thing became clear. Duke had never stopped being a soldier. He had just been waiting for his commander to come back. The next morning, I drove into the city with Duke in the back seat. He sat alert, ears forward, watching every vehicle that passed, like he was scanning for enemies. I couldn't shake the feeling that Duke knew more than I could ever explain, more than any human could guess. I met Captain Walker at a quiet diner off Highway 33. We took a corner booth near the window where Duke could sit at my feet. Walker, a thick-chested man with salt and pepper hair and calloused hands, gave Duke a long look before speaking. "He doesn't look like a ghost." "He wasn't," I replied. "He was just thrown away." Walker opened a manila folder. "I pulled your unit's debriefs and some classified incident reports. Most of it's still redacted, but there's something odd. After the ambush in Winter Haven, the report said, Duke was KIA, killed in action. No body recovered, no remains." I read that. "Here's what you didn't read," Walker said, sliding over a printed form. 2 weeks after your medevac, a cartel contact submitted a requisition order for a German Shepherd, matching Duke's description. Same weight, same scars, same behavioral triggers. They gave him a new name, Maximus. My jaw clenched. They repurposed him. "Worse," Walker said, lowering his voice. "They used him. For who? The Los Zetas cartel? They're a brutal outfit, and 3 years ago, they were running drugs and weapons across the border. No questions asked." I leaned back, stunned. "They took my dog, lied about it, rebranded him like gear, like a weapon." Walker nodded. "It gets worse. I pulled a vet file, scanned in by accident during a border patrol search. He was listed as injured during a confrontation with a handler. Not you, someone else." My chest felt like it was cracking. "They beat him," I muttered, "when he didn't follow their orders." Walker nodded solemnly. "Looks like he escaped after a failed transfer. Wounded, drugged, but he ran. Somehow made it back here. That's when the guy at the flea market found him." My blood boiled. I looked under the table. Duke was resting quietly, but his eyes flicked up to meet mine, as if he'd heard every word. "I want names," I said, my voice low. "And I want to know who's still looking for him." Walker hesitated. "That's the problem. I think Los Zetas is." I looked up. "That van you saw the other night," Walker continued. "Ran the plates through some contacts. No registration, just a dummy number tied to an old smuggling front that went dark. It's a ghost vehicle. They're still watching. Could be they're trying to cover tracks, or worse, trying to recover assets." "He's not an asset," I growled. "He's mine, and he's done being used." Walker nodded. "I can help, but you need to be ready. If Los Zetas comes back for him, they won't knock on the front door." That night, I reinforced every lock on my house. I placed motion sensor lights around the property, checked the cameras I'd barely used in years, and made sure Duke had access to every room. He followed me closely, sensing the tension. When I finally sat down on the couch, I pulled out Duke's old tactical vest from the storage bin. I held it in my hands for a long moment, then knelt beside him. "Remember this?" I asked, holding it out. Duke leaned in and sniffed the fabric. Then slowly, he pressed his head into my chest, just like he had the day we reunited. "I promise," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "No one touches you again, not without going through me." I buckled the vest gently around him, just like old times. It still fit. Outside, the wind picked up. A branch snapped against the window. Duke didn't flinch, but he didn't sleep either. He sat by the door all night, eyes fixed, ears up, waiting. By dawn, I stood beside him, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. "They think we're just going to let them take you," I muttered. "They have no idea who they're messing with." Duke wagged his tail once, slow, steady, a signal. We were back on the battlefield. Only this time, the war had come to our doorstep. The sun dipped below the horizon like a warning. I stood on the porch with Duke sitting at my side, his eyes fixed on the tree line that bordered the property. A storm of dread churned in my gut. Every instinct from my years of service told me something was coming, something we couldn't avoid. By now, I'd reviewed the documents Walker gave me a dozen times. The Los Zetas cartel was as real as it was dangerous, and if they'd invested in trained K9s like Duke, they wouldn't take losing him lightly. The asset they lost had value, not just in dollars, but in what he knew. Duke had memory, and someone out there saw that as a threat. Inside, I set down new bags of supplies, water bottles, first aid kits, a flare gun. I wasn't planning to run, but I was planning for more. Duke paced the house, ears twitching at every creak. He moved like a soldier, always between me and the windows, always watching the door. When night fell, we turned off the lights. I didn't want to be seen. I placed Duke's vest on again. Black canvas, faded from dust and sun, with the Velcro tag that still read, Duke, K, 9 Unit 66 Bravo. You ready, boy? I whispered, scratching gently behind Duke's ears. He gave one short, low bark. That's when the power cut out. Everything plunged into darkness. I didn't flinch. I reached for my flashlight and gun in one motion. Duke growled, a deep, steady rumble from his chest, not loud, but full of warning. Someone was on the property. I moved to the kitchen window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. 3 figures, dark clothes, moving low, no flashlights, trained. I cursed under my breath and ducked back. They're here, I said, glancing at Duke. He was already at the back door, nose pressed to the floor, tracking their movement. Seconds later, glass shattered, one of the living room windows. I raised my weapon. Stay low, I told him. But Duke did the opposite. He bolted. Duke, no. Too late. He sprinted into the living room and lunged straight at the first intruder coming through the window. A yell. A body hit the floor. I charged in, saw 2 more shapes rush toward the hallway, and fired one warning shot into the ceiling. Get out of my house, I shouted. Another shout. One of the men turned back and raised a weapon. I ducked behind the couch as a silenced round split the air. Duke was still fighting, snarling, tearing, pushing back with brutal precision. The man under him screamed, then went silent. The second intruder tried to drag Duke off, but I tackled him from behind, slamming my shoulder into his back. We hit the floor hard, fist, elbow, gun. I wrestled the weapon free and turned it on the man's face. Move, and you die. He raised his hands. Outside, sirens wailed, growing louder. Walker. I'd tripped the silent panic alert embedded in the back hallway before the lights went out. Help was coming. The third man tried to run. Duke started after him, moving like a shadow. He tackled the last intruder on the front lawn, holding him down until police arrived, teeth bared, growl never wavering. Minutes later, the yard was filled with lights, red and blue flashing through the trees. Officers flooded the property. Walker stepped out of an unmarked SUV, bulletproof vest over his shirt, weapons still drawn. You all right? He called. I nodded, panting. Blood trickled from my eyebrow. My knuckles were raw. I'm fine, I said. But they weren't here to scare us. They were here to take him. I looked over at Duke, standing in the headlights, still wearing his vest, chest heaving, eyes wild but focused. Walker walked over and knelt beside him. This dog's been through hell, he said, and he still chose to protect you. He never stopped, I said, my voice thick. That night, after the house was cleared, after the bodies were taken and the arrested men were hauled off, I sat on the porch again, arms resting on my knees. Duke sat beside me. For a while, neither of us moved. Then I said, They thought you were just a weapon. I looked down at him. But you're the soul of every man you ever saved, and I swear you'll never be property again. Duke leaned gently against me, his weight solid and steady. In the silence that followed, I knew one thing. This battle was over, but the war to protect Duke and dogs like him had just begun. The days after the break-in were a blur of police reports, press inquiries, and sleepless nights. My home became a temporary stronghold. Officers patrolled the perimeter. Security systems were upgraded. Reporters called nonstop, asking how a war hero and his resurrected dog managed to stop a trained team of cartel enforcers. But I didn't care about headlines. I only cared about Duke. He hadn't left my side. He followed me from room to room, slept near the bed, and only ate when I sat with him. Something in him had shifted. He was alert, intense, always scanning, like the fight wasn't over. Walker visited again that week. He carried a new folder and a strange look in his eyes. "I've been digging," he said, laying the papers on my kitchen table. "You were right. They weren't here for revenge. They were here to silence him." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Walker flipped open the folder. "One of the men we arrested used to work for Los Zetas, but get this, he was also operating near Winter Haven 3 years ago, during the same month you and Duke were hit." I stood straighter. "That's not a coincidence." "No, it's a cover-up," Walker said. "We believe Los Zetas wasn't just smuggling drugs. They were using canines like Duke to run off-record ops across the border. No oversight, covert tracking, silent takedowns. And Duke? He was one of the best. They reprogrammed him after the ambush." My stomach turned. "You mean they brainwashed him?" "They tried," Walker said. "But he broke protocol, bit a handler, ran off during a transfer. That's when he was officially lost. They couldn't risk anyone finding out. And now that he's home, they're scared," I finished. Walker nodded. "He remembers too much. Faces, places, procedures." I looked down at Duke, lying quietly under the table. His ears twitched at every sound. His eyes were half closed, but I knew. He was listening to every word. "I can't believe they used him like that," I muttered. "He was a soldier, not a tool." Walker leaned in. "There's more. The team you stopped, they weren't acting alone. There's chatter that someone higher up is watching. Someone who still wants Duke erased." My jaw tightened. Let them try. That night, I made a decision. I pulled out a dusty duffel bag from my closet, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were pieces of a past I'd tried to bury. My old fatigues, a pair of boots, maps marked in pencil, and a small dog whistle engraved with 66B Duke. I called Duke over. He came immediately, tail still, eyes focused. I held out the whistle. "We never finished the mission," I said. "And now I think maybe we still can." I spent the next 3 days retracing everything. I looked through Duke's old mission logs, cross-referenced them with the Los Zetas files Walker had dug up. Piece by piece, I began to understand the final operation before the ambush. There was a name, Kellen Reeve, a cartel operative who disappeared shortly after the incident. His file was thin, too thin, and Duke reacted every time I said the name out loud. On the 4th morning, I packed the truck, not to run but to investigate. Duke jumped in without hesitation, tail wagging once in approval. We drove west, toward an abandoned safe house in New Mexico, once used for cartel operations and cross-border smuggling. Rumor had it Los Zetas had staged unauthorized activities there right before the Winter Haven ambush. When we arrived, the place was deserted, chain-link fences rusted and bent, watchtowers empty, windows shattered. But as soon as I stepped out, Duke began sniffing the air, then the ground. Then he froze. I followed his gaze. A door to the main building hung open just slightly. "Duke," I whispered. "Lead." He moved like a ghost, low, quiet, every muscle trained for this. I followed, weapon drawn. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. Old papers littered the floor. Maps hung torn on the walls. Duke turned into a side room and stopped. In the corner, a locked filing cabinet. I forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, hard drives, disks, folders marked cartel operations, and at the top, a photograph. A younger Duke, in full gear, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. I flipped the photo over. Asset K 966B, reassigned handler, K. Reeve. I stared at the name, then at Duke. They used you, reprogrammed you, sent you on cartel missions, and when you broke free, they wanted to erase the evidence. Duke didn't bark. He didn't whine. But I swore I saw something in his eyes. Recognition, rage, and resolve. I placed a hand on his back. It ends now, I said. No more secrets. No more hiding. Outside, a dust storm began to form on the horizon. But Duke and I stood ready together again, not just as partners, but as survivors, ready to expose everything. I didn't sleep that night. The hard drives, documents, and photographs we found at the safe house sat neatly stacked on the passenger seat as we drove through the desert before dawn. Duke sat upright beside me, ears alert, gaze fixed out the windshield like a sentinel. Neither of us needed to speak. We both understood the weight of what we were carrying. We weren't just hauling evidence, we were carrying the final chapter of a betrayal no one wanted exposed. I'd called Walker hours earlier and arranged to meet him at a secure FBI liaison office in El Paso. The files we uncovered had enough to sink what was left of Los Zetas operations and implicate several high-level operatives who'd been hiding behind fake identities and silent deals for years. But it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about honoring Duke. It was about finally giving meaning to what he'd endured. By 10 a.m., we arrived at the building. The parking lot was quiet, and security waited at the door. I walked in with Duke at my side, head held high, tail steady. His K9 vest was tight around his chest, the name patch still attached. Duke, K9 Unit 66, Bravo. Inside, Walker stood waiting with two agents. When he saw the files, his eyes widened. "You did it," he said. I dropped the folder on the table. "They used him. They lied to me. They used all of us." Walker nodded. "We'll take it from here. This is enough to launch a full investigation." I looked down at Duke. It better be. As the agents began to scan the documents and images, I stepped out into the hallway where Duke sat down beside a water cooler. I lowered myself to the floor next to him and exhaled slowly. "You remember him," I said softly, pulling the photo of Kellen Reeve from my pocket. "He was the one who tried to replace me. The one who hurt you?" Duke didn't react, but I could feel it. Beneath his quiet calm, something was still unfinished. Just then, an agent poked his head into the hallway. "There's something else," he said. "We ran facial recognition on Reeve. He's alive. New name, new ID. He's been working as a smuggler in Arizona. We're trying to get a location." I stood. "I want to be there when you find him." The agent looked hesitant. "That's not protocol." "I don't care." Walker emerged from the room and placed a firm hand on the agent's shoulder. "He's earned it." 2 days later, they found him. Kellen Reeve was living under the name Jason Rory, just outside Tucson, a desert stash house, off-grid, the type of place people go to disappear. The FBI moved in swiftly. I rode in one of the unmarked vehicles, Duke sitting beside me, head slightly lowered, but body coiled with energy. As the agents surrounded the property, I stepped out and approached the front door. I had no weapon, just a file folder. And Duke. Reeve answered the door with a smirk. He was older now, beard trimmed, eyes sharp. "Well," he said, if it isn't the soldier and his mutt. Duke growled, low, steady. I didn't flinch. You ran cartel ops using a stolen dog. You beat him, reprogrammed him, then left him for dead. Reeves' expression darkened. You've got no proof. I have your name, your picture, your fake ledgers, and the dog you tried to erase. Duke stepped forward now, ears back, teeth bared. Reeves' hand twitched like he was considering something. That's when the agents swarmed. He was cuffed within seconds. Duke never looked away from him until the cuffs clicked shut. The desert sun was climbing higher as Duke and I walked away from the stash house, the FBI agents still swarming the property behind us. Reeves' smug face lingered in my mind, but the weight of the files we'd uncovered felt heavier than ever. Duke trotted at my side, his K9 vest snug against his chest, the name patch, Duke, K9 Unit 66 Bravo, catching the light. His ears flicked forward, alert as always, but there was a calm in his step now, like he knew we'd just closed a chapter. I wasn't so sure it was over, but for the first time in days, I let myself breathe. We climbed into the truck, the hard drives and documents still stacked on the passenger seat. Duke settled beside me, his head resting on my thigh, eyes half closed but never fully relaxed. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. We did good, boy, I said, my voice low. He didn't move, but his tail gave a single slow thump against the seat. That was enough. By the time we hit the highway heading back toward Georgia, I thought the worst was behind us. I was wrong. 2 days after we got home, the first news van showed up. It parked across the street from my house. A sleek white vehicle with a satellite dish and a logo I didn't recognize. Then another arrived, and another, until my quiet stretch of road looked like a media circus. Reporters in pressed suits and cameramen with heavy gear milled around my front yard, their voices carrying through the morning air. I stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, Duke sitting steady at my side. His eyes tracked every movement, every stranger, like he was still on duty. Mr. Wilson, a young woman in a blazer called out, waving a microphone as she pushed past a hedge. I'm with Channel 7 News. Can we get a statement about what happened in Arizona? About the dog? Her cameraman zoomed in, the lens glinting in the sunlight. Duke let out a low growl, barely audible, but I felt it through the boards beneath us. I set my mug down on the railing, my jaw tight. No comment, I said, turning to head inside. But they didn't stop. By noon, there were half a dozen news crews camped out, their questions overlapping like gunfire. Is it true you took down a Los Zetas operative single-handed? How did your dog survive the Winter Haven ambush? What's in those files you gave the FBI? I kept the curtains drawn, the door locked, but their voices seeped through the walls. Duke paced the living room, his claws clicking against the hardwood, his ears twitching at every shout from outside. I knelt beside him, running a hand over his scarred flank. They don't get it, do they? I said. This isn't about headlines. It's about us. He leaned into me, his weight grounding me like it always had. That afternoon, I called Walker. They're swarming my house, I said, glancing out the window at a reporter snapping photos of my truck. What do I do? His voice was steady, like he'd seen this before. They'll move on if you give them something. Just enough to satisfy their story. You don't owe them the whole truth. I hung up, my stomach twisting. I didn't want to talk, didn't want to turn what Duke and I had been through into some cheap news segment. But I also knew they wouldn't leave until they got their soundbite. By evening, I made up my mind. I stepped onto the porch, Duke at my heel, his vest still on like a badge of honor. The reporters surged forward, microphones thrusting toward me, cameras rolling. I raised a hand and they fell silent, waiting. I looked down at Duke, his eyes locked on mine, steady as ever. Then I faced the crowd. My name's Daniel Wilson, I said, my voice firm. This is Duke, my partner. 3 years ago, I was told he died in an ambush in Winter Haven, tracking narco-traffickers. I believed it, until I found him again at a flea market in Brooklyn. Los Zetas took him, used him, tried to break him, but he never broke. He came home. What happened after that? I paused, feeling the weight of every scar on his body, every fight we'd faced together. We did what soldiers do. We finished the mission. The reporters erupted with questions, but I didn't flinch. Why'd they come after him? One shouted. What was in the files? Another pressed. I shook my head. That's for the FBI to handle. All you need to know is this. Duke isn't just a dog. He's a hero, and no one's taking him from me again. I turned, Duke following close, and walked back inside. The door shut behind us, muffling their calls. Would you like to hear more stories about veteran dogs like Duke? If so, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next veteran dog stories.